we're excited to have Lon here to present some new research he's been working on related to gender and the workforce. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to you to get started. And we're going to hold most of our substantive comments. We'll hold, oh, showing up on that one.
Thanks.
Yeah. All right, we're going to hold substantive feedback to the very end, but please feel free to ask clarifying questions as well during the talk. So, right.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. And also, I'd like to thank Stephanie and Alan and everyone on the Colloquium committee for putting together this really useful Colloquium series. So I was telling Stephanie the other day that instead of presenting a more polished paper like most of the previous speakers in our series have done, I decided I'd like to present this really early stage work in progress because I can really use your feedback on it. So it's really work in progress, mostly because of the data. The data was really huge and messy that it took me a while to finish cleaning the data. And in fact, I didn't finish cleaning the data until last week, and I've only just started writing the first draft. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your feedback and advice on how to shape and improve this paper. Having said that, I'm really excited about this paper because it helps kickstart my new line of research on administrative burdens. And also, secondly, I'm originally from Vietnam, so I've always wanted to study something about Vietnam, but it started till last year that I very fortunately gained access to this really cool data from Vietnam that allowed me to study the gender factor in administrative burdens in Vietnam. All right, so I'd like to quickly motivate my research by citing this quote from this really landmark, groundbreaking book, Policy 2018, called "Administrative Burdens: The Policymaking in Other Means," I think, by Pamela Hurd and Don Moynihan. So this book was among the pioneering works that introduced the concept of administrative burdens in citizen-state interactions to our public administration literature. So thanks to such seminal works, there's been the idea of administrative burdens in citizen-state interactions have gained massive attention in both research and practice in the last decade. So understanding the significance of administrative burdens in citizen-state interactions, Hurd and Moynihan in particular argue that one of the central questions to the study of public policy and public administration is this one: how can we minimize the negative effects of administrative burdens while ensuring that the state is still able to achieve legitimate goals? So a quick conceptual framework, especially for those of you who are not very familiar with this literature. So people like Hurd and Moynihan and others have argued typically that administrative burdens is a function of three types of burdens, three types of costs: learning burdens, psychological burdens, and compliance burdens. So learning burdens means the cost of finding and learning information about government services. Psychological burdens refer to any types of mental discomfort and stress when citizens engage with the government, engage with public administrative processes. And lastly, compliance burdens refers to the cost of having to comply with all kinds of onerous rules and requirements and paperwork when dealing with the government. And people in this literature in the last decade have increasingly pointed out that these burdens are consequential, distributive, and constructive. One is consequential because these burdens make a difference in our lives, clearly. Secondly, these burdens are distributive in the sense that they help or hurt some groups in our society more than others. So these burdens, unfortunately, reinforce inequalities in any society. And lastly, they're constructive, which means that they are rarely random or arbitrary. Typically, they are the deliberate result of deliberate actions and decisions by policymakers and public administrators. My study aims to contribute to this literature by exploring the role of citizen gender, how gender might affect citizens' experience of administrative burdens in their interaction with the state. And there's been a lot of research on the role of gender in public affairs in general, pointing out how gender can shape one's experience of public affairs in many ways. In the literature of administrative burdens, though, this is a very, very nascent line of research. In fact, I found only like a few papers who have explored this idea. So Hurd and Moynihan's 2018's exploration of women's access to reproductive health care in the US. And also very worth noting was the study in Australia a couple of years ago, the study child support in Australia. But a few books like that have suggested qualitatively that administrative burdens are very likely gendered, or in other words, men and women tend to experience administrative burdens. Inquiries remains a question, and it also remains a question how that dynamics might be different when it comes to different types of burdens, right? So that's the first question that my study wants to look at. The second mystery kind of that my study wants to explore is the role of frontline state agents. So we already have some qualitative evidence that the gender of the citizens matters. What about the gender of the frontline state agents that the citizens interact with when they interact with the state? So I'm sure you're all aware there's this huge representative bureaucracy literature that pointed out that the identity of a frontline bureaucrat matters, right? So, for example, that literature has pointed out that in many contexts, the identity of a frontline state agent, like in terms of their gender, race, social economic status, and so on, matters in how they interact with citizens. So, and that can help them actively or symbolically, right? And so we have reasons to hypothesize that the same mechanism might apply here in this context of administrative burdens as well. So to study that, this is my research design. So my research setting is Vietnam, where I'm from. And while I chose Vietnam, not simply because I'm from Vietnam and I like to study something about Vietnam, but it's arguably a really good context for this study because both the present representation bureaucracy literature and the administrative burdens literature have suggested that the effects of representation and burdens tend to matter more in what they call salient context. So Vietnam, I would argue, is a really good salient context for this study because it has a pretty, I would say, relatively high level of structural gender inequality. Influence, I think, in many ways, shaped in many ways, like culturally, for example, it inherited thousands of years of influence of influence from this Confucian philosophy, Confucian culture, stemming from ancient China, which has very clearly defined gender role and expectations that sometimes, well, a lot of times, put female citizens in a disadvantaged position, right? So growing up, for example, I've heard of many sayings from that culture, from that philosophy, like which means at home serving your father. Xuất giá tộc phu is after you get married, serve your husband. And phu tử tộc tử, which means after your husband dies, serve your son. So I think sayings like that I can illustrate really well how Vietnam and similar cultures like that have a very high level of structural gender inequality. And I'm not citing them here, but there's been a bunch of papers pointing out that it's true in the context of public affairs as well. It's true that in the sense that female citizens in Vietnam are a lot less likely to get involved with public affairs. And so that's all to say that it's a good salient context, I would argue. So my research subjects include over 100,000 Vietnamese citizens, and the data came from the latest 2011-2021 data from the Vietnam Provincial Governance and Public Administration Performance Index, or PAPI. So it's a really cool project. So it's the largest public affairs data collection project in Vietnam, run by several organizations, but most prominently the Vietnam Fatherland Front, which is the largest political organization in Vietnam, led by the Vietnam Communist Party, which many of you probably know is the only official ruling party in Vietnam that controls pretty much the government and politics in Vietnam. But since 2011, every year they try to interview citizens in every single province in Vietnam to gauge their level of experience with and perception of local government performance. As you can see here from their report, the purpose is to generate information that can improve the performance of local governments in two ways. One, by enabling citizens to share their experience with local governments, to benchmark their government's performance, and to advocate for local government improvement. And secondly, to create constructive competition and to promote learning, sharing learning among local governments. So it kind of has a spirit of new public management, I guess. So here's some information about how this PAPI project collected data every year since 2011. Well, it's actually started in 2009. Actually, 2009, 2010, the two testing years, so they only tried collecting data in a few provinces to fine-tune the study method. But starting from 2011, every year, like I said, they have relied on what they call a probability proportional to size random sampling method. It's really a multi-stage cluster sampling method where they sampled all 63 provinces from the north to the south in Vietnam. In each province, they would randomly pick about 3 to 4 districts based on how large the province is. Within each district, they would randomly pick 2 communes, and within each commune, they would randomly pick 2 villages, which is the smallest public administrative tier in Vietnam. It's roughly equivalent to like a neighborhood here, but for those of you who are not very familiar with the Vietnamese context. So this is a very small tier. And within each village, they would randomly select and interview about 20 citizens. The purpose of this sampling strategy, as they say here, is to get a sample, a nationally representative sample of citizens every year. And how do they conduct these interviews? Well, every year, they employ hundreds of people to represent the state, to interview these citizens face to face. And each interview lasts between 45 to 60 minutes, so pretty long interviews. And each interview requires a citizen to go to the interview location, typically what we call a communal house, like a communal hall of the community, and at a specific time, and to answer a lot of questions that can be quite technically complex because it has a lot to do with government programs and policies and rules and requirements. But also these questions can be highly stressful as well because they also gauge the experience with local government corruption, which is a very highly sensitive topic anyway, but especially so in Vietnam. So that's all to say that there's good reasons to expect that this kind of project can put a high level of administrative burdens on citizens. Right? For good purposes, I would say to get good data, but as people in the administrative burdens this year has pointed out, it's a balance. There's a balance between, like the quote earlier illustrated, fulfilling state's legitimate purposes and minimizing citizens' burdens while fulfilling those purposes. So these are the descriptive statistics. Oh, actually, one thing I forgot to say about these interviews that's very important to my identification strategy. To make these interviews objective, they use random matching. So the interviewer and the interviewees randomly matched. So this, in other words, created what resembles a national experiment, right? That would allow me to estimate the causal effects of gender congruence on administrative burdens. But I'll go more into that detail later. But some descriptive statistics of my study variables. So I have 3 variables measuring the 3 types of burdens that people had studied in this literature: learning burdens, psychological burdens, and compliance burdens. It's very important to note, and this is arguably one of the main limitations of my study. All 3 types of burdens were evaluated by the interviewers and not the interviewees at the end of each interview. So at the end of each interview, the interviewer would write down how much they think the interviewees understood the question and the information that the interviewers wanted to ask them about. So again, information about local governance programs and policy and requirements, stuff like that. Psychological burdens, at the end of the interview, each interviewer will write down how much anxiety they think the interviewee showed throughout the interview. And lastly, compliance, it means how much the citizen complied with the interviews. And by compliance here, it means many things: showing up at the interview location on time, trying to answer all of the questions without rushing the interviewer, trying to think about each question and answer carefully and stuff like that. So these are 3 ordinal variables ranging from 1 to 3, with 1 being the lowest perceived level of burdens, and 3 meaning the highest perceived level of burdens. My 2 independent variables of interest are female and female interviewers, which, well, pretty straightforward. Female is the gender of the interviewee, and female interviewer was whether they were randomly matched with a female interviewer or not. I also have a bunch of control variables measuring a bunch of their pre-treatment, mostly demographic characteristics, ranging from their age to ethnicity, education level, employment, health insurance, economic status, number of children, whether they are a party member or not. And remember, there's only one party in Vietnam, so this means Communist Party, and whether they are a new interviewee or not. And you can see that from 2011 to 2021, there were nearly 150,000 interviewees, and 84 of them were new interviewees. Because sometimes they just randomly pick a village again and interview the same citizen again. Okay, so this is a kind of a naive comparison of their pre-treatment characteristics. So you can see here, for both female citizens and male citizens, those who interviewed by a same gender interviewer or not have very similar characteristics, which makes sense given the random assignment nature of the interviews. But this is naive because you don't see any significant testing here, right? So this is a more formal what they call balanced test, where I basically regress gender match on all of their pre-treatment characteristics, and you can see that nothing is significant, which is good, right? Because it means that the treatment group and the control groups are really likely the same before treatment, right? Okay, so here's my estimation strategy. So my main regression model for individual citizen I in village B in year T looks like this, where Y, the dependent variables, measure 1 of 3 types of perceived administrative burdens. F measure the citizen's gender, whether it's female or male. And A, female agent, represents whether they were interviewed by a female agent or not. This is an interaction effect between these 2 variables to test whether the gender, whether there's a gender congruence effect, right? X is a set of is a vector of control variables, so all of their pre-treatment characteristics that I mentioned earlier. Because this was a random assignment, it's obvious that whether I include this or not doesn't matter when it comes to the estimate, right? And I tested that and found it. However, including these variables help increase the precision of the regression and lower standard errors. Theta VT is village by year fixed effect, because this was the level where random assignment happened, right? And lastly, epsilon is the error term cluster at the village by year level. So some very prominent recent econometric research has pointed out that it's typically useful to cluster your standard errors at the sampling level. So that's what I did, but the result really the same whether I can cluster or not, or whether I cluster it at other levels or not.
That's because when you have the fixed effects panel, like the fixed effects in there, the calculation for the standard error is the same. So
Yeah, it's true.
It should be identical
Yeah, it's really thin. So these are the main results. First, when it comes to learning burdens, as you can see, female citizens show significantly higher learning burdens than male citizens. Female Asian didn't seem to have any significant effect on the citizens' learning burdens. And there's no significant interaction effect here either. When it comes to psychological burdens, similarly, female citizens show significantly higher psychological burdens. Interestingly now, female Asians seem to have significantly reduced perceived psychological burdens for citizens, for all citizens. But it's worth noting that they reduced psychological burdens significantly more for female than for male citizens. And this is illustrated by this significant interaction effect here, right? And it can be better illustrated by this simple plot here, right? So this red line represents male citizens perceived psychological burden, and the blue line represents female citizens perceived psychological burdens. And you can see that female Asian reduced burdens for both groups, but they did so significantly more, as indicated by the slope here, for female citizens. So the graph seems smaller, a lot smaller there. Go ahead, Stefan.
Can you remind me what the question was that we're answering with psychological burdens? I mean, what the measure is?
The measure?
Yeah.
The measure was how much stress and anxiety the interviewee expressed during the interview. Yeah, and it's important to remember this is noted down and rated by the interviewer and not the interviewee. So it is definitely a possible limitation of this paper, and I've tried to respond. I've tried to address this limitation in multiple ways, which I'm going to talk about later. When it comes to compliance burdens, which means again how much the interviewee comply with the rules and requirements of this interview by showing up on time at the right location, trying to answer every question carefully, things like that. It showed that female citizens also show significantly higher compliance burdens. And it similarly showed that female Asians seem to significantly reduce compliance burdens for both groups, but for female, much more than for male citizens. And the interaction effect, therefore, is highly significant, again, as illustrated by this plot here. So again, you can see that female Asians might have reduced the perceived psychological burdens of male citizens a little bit, but they did so by a large extent for female citizens, right? Okay. I then conducted a bunch of what I call supplemental analysis. So for first thing I did was to rerun all of the regression using nonlinear order logistic regression. So far I've used OLS because it's more simple to interpret the coefficients of OLS regressions. However, the dependent variables, they are, remember the 1, 2, 3 levels, they are ordinal variables. So technically it makes more sense to use this nonlinear order logistic regression. But I did that and found very, very similar results. So it means that the result was not biased by the linearity assumption that I made earlier. Right? Secondly, I guess more importantly, the question of measurement bias is totally natural for us to wonder how good are these measured by the interviewers? Can they provide an actual accurate estimate of the citizens' burdens? So it's a hard question to answer, but I try to explore this measurement bias in a couple of ways. First, in the data, there's, I would say, a couple of slightly more objective measures of their burdens. So this civic knowledge test. So in the interviews, there are a couple of questions where they ask the interviewees questions about their understanding of some simple government public affairs knowledge, like how long do you think is a term limit of your representative? Questions like that, right? So civic knowledge, whether they answer those questions correctly or not. So I would say it's a more objective measure of their learning burdens, right? And so I use that variable instead and found the same result, right? Which suggests that the interviewers measure measurement of learning burdens are not too biased, at least. And the second variable is home visit. So there were about 5 or 6% of the interviewees who just didn't show up. And so the interviewers, one interviewer would have to track them down. They would have to find that person's house in that village and try to do the interview at their house, right? So and then the interviewer typically would tell them that, well, that the location is way too far from my house and it's during working hours. How could I have made it there, right? So I would say that this home visit measure reflects at least partly a citizen's perceived compliance burdens, right? So if the interview was conducted at home, it means that more likely the citizen consider the interview requirements too burdensome, right? So there's less compliance. So I used this and found the same result that female citizens more likely to be interviewed at home, right? However, this variable is not perfect because it happened after the female citizen knew whether they're going to be interviewed by a female state agent or not. So I cannot really test the effect of gender congruence here. Although when I tried to do that anyways, I found that female interviewers are less likely than male interviewers to go visit the citizen home and to conduct home interviews. I would have to think a little bit more about how to interpret that though. This second idea, I haven't had enough time to explore it, but I also have interviewer ID, right? So technically, I could use interviewer fixed effects. However, I couldn't use interviewer fixed effects in the main regression simply because if I use interviewer fixed effect, then there's no variation in the interviewer's gender, right? So I don't have any variation to test their gender congruence effect, right? However, I could still use this to at least test female citizens perceived the perceived burdens on female citizens, and I did that, and I found really the same result. Like the estimates were really almost identical, which means that interview fixed effects probably do not matter much here. Which means that one, it further solidifies the idea that a random assignment happened, but I think it's also tells something about interviewers' measurement bias. But the really cool thing that I haven't had time to really think through and do it was this idea that I've been contemplating in the last couple of days. So because I have interview IDs, I can test each interviewer relative effect on the citizen on the burdens that they perceive about the citizen they interview, right? So, and I need to think more about this. This is kind of halfway idea, but I think I could control for that as a source of their measurement bias, right? But again, this is an idea that I have to think a little bit more about. I also have explored further heterogeneity, and I found, not very surprisingly, that female citizens overall face more burdens, but they face even more burdens if they were in some socially disadvantaged position, right? So if they were older, ethnic minority, less educated, poor, or less involved in public affairs. And female agents, they also reduce burdens more for these female citizens, right? And lastly, and what I really like about this data is really huge and messy, but also really rich. At the end of each interview, the interviewer is also allowed to quickly write out some notes if they really worry about the quality of the interview. So I do have some qualitative data here. In fact, over 5,000 citizens out of those 150,000 has some qualitative notes at the end of the interview. So that's what I did last. I read through. Well, fortunately, each code very short, but still there's like over 5,000 of them, so it took me a while to read through and post all of them. But I identified this a dozen themes of those notes. So the interviewer just simply write out what they think is a reason why the interview was not of the best quality. And you can see that lack of education and lack of involvement in public affairs were the top two complaints to both male and female citizens, but more so for female citizens, right? But the other themes I think show some really cool gender dynamics, right? So for example, substance intoxication number 4 complaint raised against male citizens is the last one for female citizens. Is in fact there's 0 complaint towards female citizens showing up being drunk or whatever, but a lot of male citizens show up seemingly drunk or high or something like that, right? It's also more likely for male citizens to be too busy with paid employment, right? While for female citizens, they're more likely to be busy with homemaking, right? Which is interesting because 0% of male citizens had a complaint because of they've been too busy with homemaking. So yeah, so I think this supplemental data also tell us some cool gender dynamics here. But yeah, in summary, I find that female citizens, especially if they're socially disadvantaged, tend to show more administrative burdens, and female state agents tend to reduce perceived psychological and compliance burden for all citizens, but more so for female citizens. Of course, at least for now, the study still has phases, 3 important questions. The first is the question of generalizability. Although I was fortunate to have nationally represented data, I'm not sure how much the data is generalizable to other contexts, especially to countries with significantly different cultures or politics or other characteristics, right? Another aspect of generalizability here was that it's a pretty special type of citizen-state interaction where the state reached out to the citizen to do interviews to learn about them. I would argue that typically when we think about citizen-state interaction, we tend to think about other kind of interaction where the citizen want to reach out to the state to access public services. So it's also not clear how much is generalizable to that other type of interaction. Secondly, like I said, it's a big question of measurement. I have tried, and I'm going to try to address this more, but at the end of the day, this measure did not come from the citizens themselves, right? So at the end of the day, there might still be some biases there. Although I would argue, and most people in this literature have admitted that as well, that it's really hard to measure this accurately. Even if you actually interview the citizens themselves, then because of all kinds of biases like social desirability bias and other stuff, it's hard even for themselves to state their correct level of perceived burdens. Right? And lastly, importantly, there's a question of mechanisms. So we know that from the study that female state agents reduce administrative burdens, but how do they do that is something that I just don't have the data to test. And there are many different ways that might have happened. Either like if you informed by the representative bureaucracy literature, then there are at least 2 ways. What they call active representation and symbolic representation. So active representation is when a frontline state agent actively try to help the citizen that they identify with, right? And symbolic representation means that the state agent actually do nothing, but the citizen just change their behavior because they feel that they are being represented. So there are many different mechanisms like that, but I don't think, at least for now, I can know for sure how it happened. But yeah, that's it, my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your question and suggestion. Thank you.
Great. So as is our tradition, let's open it to doctoral students or students in general first. I'll try to keep my eye on the chat too, and Alan's also monitoring it, so he'll pipe in if we see something there. But we've got a couple of students in the room. I don't know if either of you want to ask a question.
Just go ahead, Matthew.
I have kind of 2 questions related to each other. I was curious about I think with the compliance measure, and why the mean of it is so low. If 1.5 is supposed to be so big a midpoint of that, why do you think it's so low? And relatedly, do you know anything, or are you able to learn a little bit more about the way in which the interviewers class or rate them in each of those 3 things? Is it supposed, like, do they have a rubric that says do you meet these things, And are they supposed to be, is there supposed to be any sort of distribution across the population or across the interviewers that you could examine? I don't know how many interviewers there are, but you could at least look at the distributions across the interviewers and see if they are, if they fit the distribution that, I mean, I imagine that's supposed to be normal, but.
Yeah, I haven't, that's a really good idea. I haven't tested, whether it's normal distribution or not. I would assume so, but I can
That
test
might
that.
help with that point that you said about the validity of measurement or whatever.
Yeah, as for how they rate this, so, okay, so for before each of the state agent is sent to the village, well, they send to a province, and then each province they interview different villages. They have to go through training. So each of them, before a set of interviews each year, they will train at a satellite location like Hanoi, the capital, or Ho Chi Minh used to be the capital of the South, and so that they train how to do these interviews and how to rate this measure. I have some data on how they rate these three types of measure. First of all, learning burdens is pretty simple. Whether they think that the interviewee actually understand the questions or not. Sometimes the interviewer would just say something like just completely nonsense that just show that they don't understand the questions at all. Psychological burden is typically rated based on the interviewee's body language. So I saw that some qualitative notes that they rate each interviewee's psychological burdens by observing whether they seem really shy, they averted their eye contact. Some citizens just even shudder during the interview. And you got to understand that this is a context where citizens are actually really afraid of the government. There's no way around it. It's an authoritarian country. So although they try to keep this objective, the citizens still have this mindset that I'm being interviewed by the government, so I should be really careful about what I say. And as for compliance burdens, then it's things like whether they show up on time at the right location, when they're there, whether they seem to try to listen to each question carefully and to answer carefully. So some citizens, they would say yes or no before an interviewer finishes their question. So that's a good evidence of they not being compliant with the interviews and things like that. Did I answer all of your questions?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
One other thing I was thinking about, and this is really not important at all. I'm just curious: is there one consistent language across the country, or are there some of differences?
I mean, there's one consistent language, which is the King people's language. So there's 54 official ethnicities in Vietnam, and almost each of them has their own language. However, there's one language by the King people. I'm also a King person, and about 85% of Vietnamese citizens are King ethnicity. So in other words, 15% of the interviewees belong to other minorities. A bunch of them still learn to speak the King language, but a bunch of them did not. So that's why I control, or I mean I measure whether they're the King ethnicity or not. In the interviewer's notes at the end, a bunch of them complained that they didn't understand the question because they just didn't understand the language, and we didn't happen to have a translator there. Or sometimes if there's a translator there, it's still hard for their translator to work and to coordinate the two sides.
Other student questions? Any online? Not, let's open it up to the room for some questions. I've got one if nobody else is going to ask. So I think this is really cool. And I think you've got a really neat opportunity here to look at. So I think one of the ways that you could frame it up front is that it's almost like the census in the US, where this survey itself is itself a public service. And so I think that gets to like Stefan's question. I think you were picking up towards the end that this survey itself is actually the public service that's being provided. And so you're looking at the citizens' interaction with the interviewees. It's not so much as you're trying to understand, we do surveys of citizens all the time, and we just try to understand what was your experience when you went to get your license, your driver's license. That's not what you're studying. What you're studying is the citizens' interaction with the interviewer as a part of it, as participating in a public service.
Yeah.
So that interview process itself is a public service. And when you just said that, it's a very authoritarian government and citizens are very nervous about this interaction, I think that's really important too, because it shows that this is a high stakes interaction in some ways for citizens to engage in this, and they're being asked to do it. It's not like you said, it's not like they're seeking out a service. They're sort of being, it's a service the government wants them to provide. So I'd have to think about how I would categorize that as because you also want to, with administrative burdens, you want to think about like the type of service being provided. And in this case, they're being asked to participate in a public service, and then you're picking up on their kind of stress and strain and burden that they're experiencing during that interaction. So it just is a way of kind of reframing it as, I think that this is the service itself is the survey. And then that leads to some of the psychologists, like you and I talked about this, the psychological literature on mode effects of surveys and all of that you can bring in, I think, then too. But it's going to look very different in this context where it's not just about a survey, it's actually about doing a service for government by filling this out.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
Thank you.
Yeah. What prompted the Vietnamese government to start the project? Because it seems to me, I read it as an effort to legitimize the political regime.
Yeah, that exactly is. Well, it's initially was actually pushed by the UN, the United Nations Development Program, actually pushed the Vietnamese government to do this. But I don't know the full story, but they managed to convince the government that it's a good idea, like you said, to gain legitimacy. Also, at least according to them, to increase a sense of transparency and competition between local governments. So every year, and this data has been really influential in actual public affairs in Vietnam. So every year, each province will have some meetings to talk about this, about how our province used to be ranked number 5 and now we rank number 20 or something like that. So it introduced a sense of competition among the local governments to improve their
Oh, that's a
service.
real pity, the ranking stuff. But hey, do people have the opportunity to say, I don't wish to be interviewed, or are they picked and they have to be interviewed?
They do have the opportunity to say no, but again, it's a context that you feel really pressured to say yes.
Okay.
So I think the report says that like 85%, at least 85% of the citizens said yes.
Is there also survey into the quality or level of satisfaction with the variety of public services provided? I'm thinking of good self, the case of bureaucracy, right?
Yeah.
Showing that when people are surveyed about government in general, they have stereotypical ideas. It is too big, or it is too lazy, it's too efficient, or what. But as soon as you ask them specifically about their level of satisfaction with policing, with the fire brigade, with parks and recreation, with swimming pool, they're actually pretty happy. Is there any sort of survey of public service provision in Vietnam? Because that would be a nice compliment to this.
Yeah. So that's actually the main purpose of this project. The main purpose of this project is to ask them about their experience with and perception of local governments, local public services. So
Broken down in a variety of services.
Yeah. So they ask them, what's your experience like with local public education, local public health, local environmental governance, local police, and I think there's a couple of other things. So yeah, it's really rich data, and that's why it's really lengthy. But that's a good point. That I don't use any of the data for this paper.
I didn't see that
because at this point I don't see how how it might improve my research design. But I could think
It might
more.
affect their willingness to take part in the survey if they've had good interactions with government.
Yeah.
Right? Or their experience.
Yeah.
Is that what you were thinking?
Yes, go ahead.
Super brief follow-up on both of those. So what is the perceived legitimacy of the survey from the citizens' perspective? I mean, is this sort of performative, like we have to participate, so we're going to participate, or is this something where people feel like they're actually making a contribution?
Oh, that's a good question, and I'm not sure how I could answer it very well. I mean, I could answer that maybe based on the compliance data. maybe like Matthew said, maybe if the average is that low, it means that a lot of the citizens didn't believe that that this worth their time, and maybe it means that they don't see it as being extremely useful.
I mean, I feel like maybe the only way to know is a qualitative study, and I feel like there's like an amazing qualitative study waiting at the end of this somewhere. I don't know if anyone else agrees, but yeah, I'm just wondering like if this is something people are performing because they have to and they feel compelled to, and maybe they're afraid not to,
Yeah.
versus like, if this is a public service, I feel like I'm contributing, I'm making a difference.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, I have to think more about it. Thank you.
And Charity has a question online. I don't know what that to Charity and then Aaron. Yep, Charity.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Long, for this really interesting presentation. I was just thinking, you said that your outcome variable is a limitation because it's the perceptions of the interviewer. But I'm thinking there's a paper, I think Ken Meyer and someone else wrote it, just about survey analysis and having a different outcome variable from a different source from where all the other covariates come from. And so it's almost like the interviewer's perceptions of the interviewee's burden is like a different, like it's not coming from the interviewee, which would be where you get all the rest of the information from. So like, I don't know what your thoughts are on that. And then I was also curious about, because there's probably an abundance of qualitative data you haven't looked at, and if you have any other plans for future qualitative work.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you. So I think you're referring to what Meyer and others call a common source bias. I think, and that's what I hinted at when I talk about measurement bias. So like you said, it's really hard to guarantee that these interviewers are providing like unbiased measurement of the interviewee's actual burdens. I've come up with a couple of ways to address that limitation. But at the end of the day, I think it's still likely going to remain a major limitation of this paper that I just have to acknowledge. As for qualitative data, then yeah, I'm still debating whether I should keep that qualitative component at the end of the paper, or should I write a separate paper using the data. But the data is pretty rich, so I'll have to think more about it. Thank you.
Well, I don't know that you have to worry about common source bias, because unless there's some, and there could be, if there's some controversy about how to allocate genders. But if there isn't, or if you, in general, there isn't, maybe that's something that was put on the birth certificate years ago, and that's something the government can check. You only have, I mean, you said the results are the same when you get rid of the control variables.
Yeah.
So then you only have the survey data on the left-hand side.
Yeah.
And the rest is actually from a different source. So I don't think common source bias.
Yeah. So thanks, Stefan. And yeah, that's what I meant. So although Myers used the term common source bias, I don't think there's any common source bias here. But I think there's still measurement bias.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, in terms of whether they measure burdens correctly or not.
Aaron, did you have a comment or a question?
Sure. Well, so first of all, I want to say like this is really interesting. And one of the things that interests me about it a lot is actually not really what you're studying, but in qualitative methods, we talk quite a bit about matching of gender and race for interviewer and interviewee, and whether that produces better or more productive data collection, and if interviewees are maybe more forthcoming during those situations,
Yeah.
right? So that's not really what you're measuring here per se, but I think that it might be interesting to look at some of those discussions, because there's a lot of things that would suggest that actually a mismatch can be really useful in some contexts, and a match can be more useful in other contexts.
Yeah.
So that really interests me about it. And of course, the gender thing really interests me here too. For me, the mechanism seems pretty clear. These interviewees are not as intimidated by having a female interviewer, right? They're very scared about this situation. And when a woman comes in to interview them, they're like, well, she can't really do anything about it anyway. She doesn't have any authority, so I should be less fearsome or, have some problems. I think the measurement problem just comes in when when it's clear that this is a story about the interviewer, not so much about the interviewee per se. Because then the question, which I think you're trying to address through measurement is, are women just less attentive to or understanding of or able to capture these like burdens, right? Do they notice less anxiety? Which I think the research would potentially counteract as like a theory, because I think women are known to be more relational in and how they approach things, so might be more likely to perceive those types of anxieties. So you might be able to counteract that with
That's
the
really good.
literature a little bit.
I think that's a great point, because following that logic, then I might have underestimated the effect here, right? Because if the citizens show more anxiety, then if we follow, I think, and I agree with your logic as well, it's likely that female interviewers more likely to pick up that anxiety, and they still show lower estimate here, so it means that the actual effect should be larger. I think that's a wonderful point.
And methodologically, not I'm a qualitative person, right? But it seems like you're measuring female match, but not looking at male match. In your variable, in your interaction variable, right? It's either a female match or a 0, right?
Yeah,
And so I was just curious what the results would look for, like a male gender match too. You know, maybe.
yeah, but so I think I did capture that. I just didn't interpret it very clearly that way. But
Okay.
the way I measure it is 1 or 0. So the result, I think, just
So is
just
that-
split.
That means it's gender match a 1 if it's Jill and I.
Oh.
It's a 1, but if
Yeah.
it's Jos and Stefan, it's a 0 though, right? If
Is Joseph Stefan is 1.
is a 1 also,
Yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
all right, got it. Okay.
And lastly, your point about interviewer effects of interviewer biases is actually something that Stephanie suggested to me the other day, and I just didn't think about it. But then I looked it up, and then, like you said, I found a whole literature in the field of survey methodology, where people study whether the interviewer's identity can influence the quality of the interview.
Yeah.
And it says there are a bunch of studies that look at the effect of female versus male interviewers, and they find that the finding is pretty inconsistent. But I think the overall message is that it matters if the topic of the interview is gender, right? So if the interviews themselves has something sensitive, like when it comes to if the interview is about reproductive healthcare, for example, then the gender of the interviewer matters a lot.
I would say the context matters, maybe not just the research question, but the general context, like you're saying, this is a salient context where it might matter more than it would maybe in the US, for example.
Absolutely.
But it leads to some really interesting questions about racial and ethnic matches as well, right? Because that's discussed in this qualitative methodology literature.
Yeah, I agree. I have only one measure of the interviewer, which is the gender, but there are many other kinds of identities that
They're like the king, like
Yeah.
the late.
unfortunately not. It would be great, but no.
Now, power dynamics in interviewing,
Mhm.
even if it has something to do with the topics, so sometimes I'll have to send in grad students who are young, right, to have a conversation. I guess I'll.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I'm trying to wrap my mind around the psychological burden, because on one hand, if I'm being interviewed by a woman, I might feel more comfortable, but then I was thinking kind of the flip, because of the context. Do male interviewers have kind of stereotypes of women when they go into a room and, oh, she looks nervous.
Yeah.
Oh, she's not being very forthcoming. So thinking of it from the other side, because when I saw the data, I'm like, oh, this is just that men are sexist. That's what I saw in that graph. Rather than the flip side, which is, oh, if I'm a woman, I'm more comfortable talking to a woman.
Yes.
So I'm trying to wrap my head around.
That's a really good point, and I think it goes back to the limitation about mechanisms. It's hard to interpret what exactly happened here. Yeah, like it might be like what you said, Jill, that the female, the male state agents were just sexist. It's like, oh, that woman looks nervous, or they don't know what they're talking about. I think it's really hard to test that completely. I think some of the measure about civic knowledge and home visit, the more objective measure, show the fact that they show almost the same result. show that the interviewer was not too biased. So that I think that's as much as I can get to.
And maybe it doesn't matter, because whether or not it's a woman being interviewed by a woman feeling more comfortable, or a woman being interviewed by a man who thinks she's less competent, both, I think the results matter. Maybe we don't know exactly how,
Yeah.
but maybe it just suggests that women just need to be interviewing women, no matter what the mechanism is.
I wonder if you could
interview everyone because.
Yeah.
they lower the burden.
I wonder if you could exploit some of the, I mean, you said, what does it matter? Like, could you exploit some of the responses to the substantive questions to see, I mean, you do have somewhat of a natural experiment here, Stefan, like, as long as we believe that it was structured as a natural experiment, then do we see anything in the actual responses to, like, that you might say differently to a male versus a female?
I mean, like adding up burdens, like.
No, not the burdens, not the interviewer, because one of the challenges we have is this is all the interviewers' perceptions of the burdens. What if we actually look at some of the interviewees' responses and see if they're giving different responses to the same question?
Yeah.
Depending on being a male or female.
That's-
If
I think
we
that's a great
believe, if we believe the male or female is randomly assigned, which it looks like it is, then.
Yeah, like questions about local corruption and stuff. If they're more likely to.
Are they more likely to admit, express that there's corruption, for example,
Yeah,
or something?
I think that's a good point.
Do you have IDs for the interview?
He does.
I only have IDs for the.
No, he
interview.
doesn't.
Oh, not the interviewees. Okay.
Yeah.
Those 16% is who I.
Ah,
And then-
yeah. That's good. That would be
Yeah,
nice if you
Yeah,
could.
unfortunately, I don't have interviewee's ID. I only know whether they are a new interviewee or not.
How much information do you have on the interviewers?
How much, I'm sorry.
How much background information do you have about the interviewers?
Oh, interviewer,
Yes,
I only know the gender.
you only know them.
You don't know age or
Well,
racial ethnicity? or-
I do know that, that they are all relatively young. So the way they found these people to represent the state to go interview was that they invited, or they hired, either senior college students or recent graduates majoring in public affairs.
Hmm.
So actually the interviewers are roughly in their, I would say early 20s, and all trained in public affairs.
But you don't have any information about variation within the interviewer group. Because I think, what I fear, I think this is a gold mine. And I think your project is really, really interesting. I fear that you're going to take a lot of fights about initiatives, which is not worth fighting. So my advice would be to pursue that idea of saying, okay, what do we measure, for instance, corruption? And then the match to that, and the fact that you have something that looks like an actual experiment is really, really helpful.
Yeah.
Whereas taking the fight about this particular mission is maybe you could win it, but you could also spend a lot of time with reviewers and journalists about that.
Yes.
This is not really worth it.
Yeah. I think I would definitely follow Stephanie's and your advice to look at the measure of their responses to sensitive questions about corruption. I think that would make the paper definitely stronger.
And then you can also write a paper about their so very focused on the perception of the interviewers.
Yeah, yeah,
But
Both
make
ways.
that a research question.
yeah.
So that is upfront.
I wouldn't worry too much about limitations of generalizability. I just finished reading Nassim Taleb, The Black Swan. He's very, very critical of economics. He has a PhD, he does decision cognitive science stuff. And I'm getting a lot more appreciation for local in-depth studies. Generalizability suggests that you're looking for something that could be useful or applicable in other cultural contexts.
Mm.
I don't think that's important. What you do is delving into something into your own society or the Vietnamese society that is informative. And I think it is important to be informed about human behavior and perception in different contexts.
Mhm.
As soon as you say, I now get the feeling with generalizability, we're looking for universals. It just doesn't exist in the social world as it does in the natural. So I wouldn't worry about it. Just ditch it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I might downplay that.
And it's still a contribution to knowledge.
Thank you.
So.
Awesome. Well, we're at noon, but the good news is that Long lives here, so. So please follow up with Long afterwards, and
Thank you.
thank you again.